Welcome to episode 31 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Hennig. On this episode of the podcast, we're going to get into the latest NFL head coaching hires, what they mean for each team. Also, a special interview with 97.3 ESPN.com's own Scott Grayson. Scott traveled with the Eagles for every Eagles game. He went to London, New Orleans, Los Angeles, Chicago. He's seen the entire season, so I want to get an inside perspective from him, of his perspective from the Eagles locker room, of the Eagles, the players, and his overview of the season. And we'll wrap up the podcast with my review of the brand new Spiderman Far From Home movie, which comes out this summer. So let's open up a cold one and get started on episode 31 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Our first topic here on the Mutant Blitz Podcast, I wanted to take a little bit closer look at the new coaching hires around the NFL. Our last episode of the podcast, we were looking at the openings around the NFL, so I want to do now a follow-up. Now, it looks like every opening in the NFL has been filled, and I'll touch on some of the coordinator openings that have been filled as well. I wanted to start with the Arizona Cardinals because that has been probably the most controversial or the most talked about hiring around the league. You know, when Cliff Kingsbury was fired by Texas Tech, I figured that NFL teams would look at him for a variety of reasons. I thought, well, this is a guy who, he coached Baker Mayfield, he coached Pat Mahomes, he's seen a lot of the young guys who are in the NFL, he understands the new modern age of offenses. And I expected him to interview with the Jets. I know he was on the Jets roster over a decade ago, so I figured there would be some interest there. But before recently, I was unaware of Arizona General Manager Steve Keim's obsession with Cliff Kingsbury. And the more research I've done, I realized that Keim has been kind of had his eye on Kingsbury for a while. And Kingsbury is a guy who, he's very different. And I think that being different can be a blessing and a curse. I think that he was in a no-win situation at Texas Tech. It's very hard to recruit kids out to Lubbock, Texas. You know, when you're going up against University of Texas, you're going against TCU, Texas A&M, you're going against Baylor, you're going against Oklahoma State, LSU. You're going against a lot of schools in your region that have a lot nicer college towns than Lubbock, Texas. Western Texas is kind of in the middle of nowhere, more so than many other campuses around the United States. So for Kingsbury, it was always going to be an uphill challenge if he was going to be able to get kids to come out there. And one of the things I don't think people understand about Kingsbury is also the fact that he had a lot of trouble recruiting defensive players, especially. The offensive guys were coming for the most part, but the defensive guys was extremely difficult. And he did not have the best staff with him at Texas Tech, and that's one of the reasons why they had the amount of losing at Texas Tech, because at the end of the day, they could score with the best of them, but they couldn't stop anybody at all. So coming to the NFL, he doesn't worry about recruiting anymore. He's got a GM to help him build a roster. They bring in a defense coordinator in Vance Joseph, who's had success as a coordinator in the NFL. Has been a very good young coach. He can focus on the defense. Kingsbury is there mostly to deal with Josh Rosen. Josh Rosen, the Cardinals drafted him for a reason. And if you're Keim, you're looking at Kingsbury as your Sean McVay. You want him to come in, revolutionize the organization, change the culture, bring this young quarterback that you drafted, who's now going to have his third offensive coordinator in just his second year coming into the NFL. You want to give him some stability. I think the Cardinals hope Kingsbury brings us stability. The question is, can Kingsbury find a proper offensive coordinator to match with him? We know that Steve Sarkisian interviewed for the job and he decided thanks but no thanks. We know they interviewed Ben McAdoo. We know they've interviewed some other guys who have been offensive coordinators in the NFL because they wanted a guy with NFL experience to combine with Kingsbury's offense. I think that the success of whoever the offensive coordinator is with how Josh Rosen works within Kingsbury and that offensive coordinator system is going to be the linchpin for the Cardinals' future. Because if Rosen fails, Kingsbury fails. And if Kingsbury fails, Keim's out the door too. All three of those guys are hooked at the hip now, and their success is totally connected to each other. And I really do think, Keim may be a lifer with the Cardinals organization. He's been in the organization, worked his way up to GM over the last 15 years. But if this doesn't work out, this will now be another head coach who has not lived up to the expectations of the organization. Ever since Ken Whisenhunt got the Cardinals to a Super Bowl, the organization has never gotten beyond a certain point. And Bruce Arians was supposed to bring them over the top. And then when Arians left, then it was Steve Wilkes. And Steve Wilkes, he was just in and over his head. It just did not work out. He did not have the right coordinators around him. It was an absolute mess last year. So Keim is now hoping that Kingsbury can be that guy to bring about that change. Only time will tell if Kingsbury and Keim can actually elevate this franchise back to a playoff contender. In Atlanta, they fired all of their coordinators down there, and the offensive coordinator they hired is Dirk Cutter. And I find it very fascinating that Dirk Cutter returns to Atlanta. So Cutter's already seen Matt Ryan before, and it'll be interesting to see how they work together. I think Cutter is just a better offensive coordinator. The Buccaneers totally sent their franchise down a side trail that took them to hell by giving Cutter the keys to the kingdom. Not because Cutter's a bad guy, but Lovie Smith was a stabilizer for the Bucs organization. Cutter is just an offensive-minded guy who has been around the NFL a long time. So I think it's better off that he's offensive coordinator. And I think Atlanta has an opportunity to fix that offense, an offense that really went sideways once Steve Sarkisian came in and took over for Kyle Shanahan. The Baltimore Ravens have elevated Greg Roman to their main offensive coordinator position. Remember, Roman was the O coordinator with the 49ers. When the 49ers went to the Super Bowl, he is very familiar with mobile quarterbacks. James Urban, the quarterback coach, very familiar with mobile quarterbacks. And elevating Roman is a commitment by the organization to Lamar Jackson long term. Roman's also worked for Tyrod Taylor up in Buffalo. So you're talking about a guy who understands not just the mobile quarterbacks development, but also different types of mobile quarterbacks. Tyrod Taylor and Colin Kaepernick are two very different types of mobile quarterbacks. Kaepernick, a very special athlete with a lot of special physical gifts. Meanwhile, Tyrod Taylor, very underrated athlete, a guy who is very accurate, does not like to turn the ball over. Kaepernick, more of a gunslinger. So now you're getting basically a blank slate in Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson doesn't have any dominant traits that predispose him to be more like one or the other of Greg Roman's past pupils. Also remember, James Urban, the quarterback coach, worked with Michael Vick in Philadelphia. So you have a quarterback coach and an offensive coordinator who are the perfect fit for their young quarterback, Lamar Jackson. Let's head over to Cincinnati. Reports are that the Bengals want to hire Zach Taylor to be their new head coach. Of course, Taylor's on the postseason, so nothing has been made official. The danger for Cincinnati is Zach Taylor is very raw when it comes to NFL experience. And my biggest concern with him isn't his age. People get bent out of shape over people's age. I think that's very unfair. I'm more concerned about the fact that Zach Taylor doesn't have a lot of NFL experience. One of the things that got overlooked about Sean McVay is that McVay had been around the NFL for a very long time. It's not like McVay was just some new kid who just happened to show up. No, Sean McVay is a guy who had been around the NFL as a child because of his family. He had been coaching in the NFL for 10 years before he ever got the Rams job. So he elevated himself from an assistant wide receivers coach to a tight ends coach to an offensive coordinator for 2-3 years before he got the Rams job. Zach Taylor does not fit that mold. Zach Taylor has only been around the NFL as a coach since 2012. So he has 4 less years of coaching in the NFL as compared to McVay. Taylor is a guy who doesn't have the same NFL pedigree that McVay does. And while we're in a league that's looking for the next Sean McVay and they assume the next guy might be on his staff, you have a guy in Taylor, Miami Dolphins assistant offensive quarterbacks coach in 2012, 2013, 2015 quarterbacks coach, 2015 elevated to offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach for a short amount of time when Joe Philbin was fired. Then what does he do? He ends up in LA with Sean McVay in 2017 assistant wide receivers coach, elevated the quarterback coach this season. Yes, he had 1 year in college as well in between the Dolphins and Rams jobs as an offense coordinator and quarterback coach. This is a guy who's not been coaching that long. Yes, he's a couple years older than Sean McVay, but experience does not match. And my biggest concern, even though I had said before, I think the Bengals need an offensive-minded coach, I'm concerned about what kind of leadership qualities he has, how he's going to handle the locker room, because one of the things about McVay is he walks in a room, he has a presence about him, everyone says. McVay is a captivating personality. He's a captivating individual. He has a presence. He has the leadership qualities. You watch him in the Rams locker room, you see a guy who handles everybody, and they all respect him. Can Zach Taylor walk into the mess that is the Cincinnati Bengals and garner the same respect from the Bengals players? I'm not sure. The Bengals got to figure out a lot of things. Andy Dalton, their future quarterback. How much of a defensive overhaul do they want to do after having one of the worst statistical defenses in their franchise history? This is a franchise that had defensive-minded coaches for the last 2 decades. Now they finally get an offensive-minded guy in there. How much of a rebuild is this going to be? How committed are they to Zach Taylor long-term? Is it 3 years? Is it 5 years? Only time will tell. I think Zach Taylor definitely has the potential to not succeed in Cincinnati for a variety of reasons. The dysfunction of the organization, the uncertainty at quarterback. Who is his staff going to be? Is he going to get the best coordinators that are going to help him? Only time will tell. Now, the northern part of the state with the Browns, Freddie Kitchens is elevated. Think about this. In 1 year, you go from the offensive coordinator and now you're head coach. A crazy ascension for Freddie Kitchens, but a lot of it has to do with Baker Mayfield. Baker Mayfield is comfortable with the guy, and I can't blame the Browns for doing this. Look, you have a guy in Baker Mayfield who he had success last year, and you still had a chance at making the postseason. And what do? You bring in a guy in Todd Monken to be the offensive coordinator for Kitchens. That allows Kitchens to have a guy who's been around the NFL for a really long time, a guy in Todd Monken who's worked with a lot of different quarterbacks. Last year he worked with Jameis Winston and Ryan Fitzpatrick. And it's something where people overlook the fact that the success of the Bucs offense had a lot to do with Monken. It did not have to do with just Dirk Cutter, because Dirk Cutter handed the keys over to the play calling to Monken. So this is a guy who helped elevate a Bucs offense that really was stagnant when Dirk Cutter was doing the play calling. He also has college experience. He coached at Oklahoma State. He coached at Southern Miss. He coached at Louisiana State. This is the guy who understands the NFL and the college coaching game. So you're bringing that kind of experience with you. I think it's a big deal to have on that staff, a guy who understands Baker's college background and understands how it can apply to the NFL working with Freddie Kitchens. I'm fascinated to see how Steve Wilks works as defensive coordinator. Steve Wilks is the guy who worked a lot of years with Ron Rivera over in Carolina before he got the Cardinals job. I think Wilks can still be a very good defensive-minded coach. He has a background with defensive backs. The secondary for the Browns was inconsistent at times last year. Maybe they look at Wilks with his 4-3 defense and says this is going to be a good fit to fill the void left by Greg Williams. Also, with Williams gone and going to the Jets, and we'll get to the Jets in a minute, Wilks, I think, is a different voice. Sometimes you need a new voice in a locker room for that kind of change. I mentioned Greg Williams. He is now the defensive coordinator with the Jets with their new head coach, Adam Gase. Very intriguing hire by the Jets. I think Gase is a guy who brings a unique skill set to this team, and that is Adam Gase, everywhere he's been, has had really good running backs. The running backs in Miami were among the best in the NFL during his time there. When he has coached with the Broncos, when he has coached with the Bears, what has been the consistent factor? He has had a top 10 rushing offense everywhere he's been. 2013, 2014 in Denver, top 10 rushing offense. Bears 2015, Miami Dolphins last 3 years. So he's gotten a lot of production out of the running back position. And having a good running game is going to be essential in taking pressure off of a young quarterback and Sam Darnold. So that the Jets, they didn't get the quarterback guru, the super offensive genius. No, instead what they did was they went out and got a guy in Adam Gase who understands the importance of the running game to couple with the quarterback. Now, the beauty is that they've also set up the defense to have success as well. Greg Williams, boisterous personality, also a guy who has worked with a lot of great defenses. Remember, Greg Williams worked with Sean Taylor in Washington. He worked with Malcolm Jenkins in New Orleans. This is a guy who everywhere he's gone, he has developed young talent. And now you're pairing him, super young talent, with the Jets. And it's a very deep defensive draft this year. The Jets are going to have some opportunities to get some more pieces for Greg Williams on that defense. I think the Jets have a lot of opportunities to be successful very quickly. I'm not saying they're going to go from worst to first or anything like that. The Patriots own the AFC East, but I do think that Gaze's history of success with the running game combined with Greg Williams invigorating new life into that defense is going to be a big deal for the Jets. Let's flip it over to Denver. Nick Fangio, the former defensive coordinator for the Bears, is now going to Denver. Older coach, more experience. I'm very intrigued to see how this is going to work out because Fangio is a guy who he's not going to look at the offense. He's going to focus mostly on the defense, and he's going to try to bring some new life to a defense that's got a lot of talent. Look, they got Chris Harris. They got Bradley Chubb. They got Von Miller. They have a lot of talent in that defense, but the defense has been underwhelming for the last few years. So how do you change it up? You bring in a new voice. And I think that Fangio, he's very different than Vance Joseph's style. He has a very different perspective. He's much more creative. He has much more disguises. One of the reasons why the Bears defense has been so good. Also, he was defensive coordinator with the San Francisco 49ers when he had guys like Patrick Willis. So he understands the linebackers and blitzing and forcing turnovers. The question is, whoever the Denver Broncos hired for their offensive coordinator, is that guy going to be the guy that fits what John Elway wants? Remember, Elway's looking for his quarterback, and he wanted Gary Kubiak to be the guy, but they couldn't agree on the offensive staff. So Gary Kubiak is now working in Minnesota with Stefanski and with Mike Zimmer on the Vikings offense. There's this huge void now. They got to figure out what kind of offense coordinator do they want. They want a more traditional guy. They want a spread guy. They want a new age. They want young, old. How are they going to go with offensive coordinator? It's going to tell a lot what they do, not just in the NFL draft, but in free agency. I think everybody knows Case Keenum is a solid backup, solid starter, but he's not going to elevate your football team in any way. So this is a man that they're going to bring in here. The question is it going to be like a Nick Foles? Is it going to be a Joe Flacco? Are they going to try and get a Dwayne Haskins or a Kyler Murray in the draft? There's a lot of questions that the Broncos have to answer moving forward. The defense may be fixed with Fangio, but the offense still has a lot of question marks. Green Bay Packers hired Matt LaFleur. Matt LaFleur, like Zach Taylor, is another one of these guys who's had a very quick ascension to a head coaching opportunity. You know, LaFleur is another one of these guys because he's been associated with Kyle Shanahan. He's worked with Sean McVay. So people look at him and say, okay, this is a guy who's worked with two of the best offensive minds in the NFL today. So something must have rubbed off on him. And I don't think that's totally incorrect. I think that people's perspective on LaFleur's success or lack thereof at Tennessee last year is very harsh. You know, they didn't really have a healthy Marcus Mariota most of the season. You were having Blaine Gabbert play way more snaps than he should have last season, and I think that hurt that offense's ability to be successful. You know, LaFleur's background is very interesting. I'm surprised that he didn't end up in Denver because LaFleur's first NFL job was with Gary Kubiak, and Gary Kubiak and John Elway are very close friends. It was Kubiak who recommended LaFleur to be on the Redskins staff starting in 2010 through 2013 with Mike Shanahan. And then Kyle brought him to Atlanta with him when they made their Super Bowl run. And then McVay picked him up for 2017 when he first went to Los Angeles. I get the feeling from everything I've heard from different reporters and everything I've read that LaFleur must have gone in that meeting with the Packers and just blown them away. He must have had a PowerPoint presentation or said something that must have really impressed Mark Murphy and that upper management of the Packers, because This is an organization that understands they have a small window with Aaron Rodgers. They have to maximize this future Hall of Famer in Green Bay. And apparently LaFleur and Rodgers, they've connected. Rodgers likes what LaFleur is presenting to him. They bring in Nathaniel Hackett, a guy who basically got a raw deal in Jacksonville. Hackett was basically the scapegoat for an absolute disaster that's the quarterback position in Jacksonville. So you're bringing in a lot of new, fresh blood to the Green Bay Packers. Maybe more innovation, a little bit, maybe more creativity, bringing to the offense that keeps stability on the defensive side with Mike Pettin, a guy that players do like playing for. Hopefully these changes match up to lead a little bit more success for this organization, because I'm telling you right now, the Packers have not had success, not because of Aaron Rodgers, but because of the fact that they've had a lot of depth issues on both sides of the ball. They've had no creativity on the offensive side of the ball, and the defense has been very underwhelming until recently. So I think for the Packers, they need to check a lot of boxes, and they need to have another good draft to ensure that LaFleur is successful with Rodgers. And you know what? They got some tough decisions to make. I know that Randall Cobb may not come back. I understand that they need to make some additions to the offensive line. So there's going to be some changes coming for the Packers. The question is, are the changes going to be enough to elevate this team to where they need to be? Brian Flores, according to reports, is going to be the Dolphins head coach. I'm actually a little surprised about that, not because of Flores per se, but because I really felt like Chris Richard made a lot of sense for Miami. Richard has a presence about him. Richard is a guy who walks into a room and he demands your attention. He demands your respect. And I felt for a while, Richard was going to be the guy. And it seems like Flores had a great interview. The upper management of the Dolphins really liked him. The owner seems to really like what Flores brought to the table. But we know the history. These Patriot assistants do not have a lot of success in the NFL. Outside of Bill O'Brien, the Bill Belichick tree has not produced many winning football coaches. Romeo Crennel, Charlie Weiss, these guys have not had success away from New England. Josh McDaniels struggled mightily to build a program over in Denver. Now, I've heard that Brian Flores is very different than the other coordinators and assistants that have come through New England because of how he carries himself, how he views himself, how he views his role under Belichick. So I'm figuring that what makes him so different than the other people who have been Belichick's D coordinator, the Patricias and the Crennels, those differences is what is also the Dolphins' appeal for him to come down there. Flores, his success is going to be dependent on two things. One, who his coordinators are. Is he going to get the right offensive and defensive staff that's going to help him maximize his ability to be a head coach? Is he going to be a micromanager, or is he going to be a hands-on guy? What is really going to be his role in this team? Belichick is more of a CEO. He's not a micromanager. Whereas you look at a guy like Doug Peterson. Doug Peterson is calling the offense. He's very focused on the offense. He lets the defense coordinator coach the defense. So for Flores, is he going to focus on the defense, or is he going to be a CEO, oversee the whole organization? The other thing is, who's his quarterback? Is it Tannehill? Are they going to draft a quarterback? Are they going to trade for a quarterback? We know that Nick Foles and Joe Flacco may be available. Tyrod Taylor may be available. Do they draft a Kyler Murray? Do they try to make a move to get a young quarterback, maybe like a Teddy Bridgewater in free agency? There's a lot of questions about the future of the Dolphins franchise. And I think it primarily starts with who Flores gets on his staff. And then after that, the next step is who is the quarterback. If they don't get both of those things right, Flores will be 3 or 4 years done in Miami, and they'll be hitting the reset button again. Finally, I want to touch on the Bucs situation. I'm surprised that Bruce Arians came out of retirement. I really felt like Arians was really going to have a flourishing career as a broadcaster and analyst. I felt like he was made for the job. He had already made some comments in the booth that were very hypercritical of his fellow coaches, so I felt like he was already invested in being done coaching. But apparently, he's very intrigued by working with Jameis Winston. He really wants to go in there and attack this situation in Tampa. And now he brings in Byron Leftwich, who he has worked with in the past, a guy who understands what Arians likes to do. Leftwich is a guy who played in the NFL. We saw that when he took over as offense coordinator with Josh Rosen last year, he did have more success than Mike McCoy did with Rosen. And I think Leftwich's his history in the NFL, along with what we know, the players he's worked with and the offense he's worked in, may be between him and Arians the right fit for Jameis Winston. In many ways, you could argue Jameis Winston is basically a more athletic version of Byron Leftwich. Guys with long windups in the release of the ball, two guys who have strong builds, strong upper bodies. You know, they may not always have the best footwork with their lower body, but they're competitors. I think Leftwich, who's a guy who had played in the NFL as a starter, was a backup for Ben Roethlisberger, understands a little bit more than Dirk Cutter and others, maybe what Jameis Winston needs to hear and what he needs to do to be successful. Arians is a guy that every quarterback he's worked with has been successful. Carson Palmer, Andrew Luck, Ben Roethlisberger. Arians understands quarterbacks. So if anyone's going to maximize what Jameis Winston can do, it's going to be these guys. This is the organization, the Glazer family and the Bucs saying, look, we are going to invest in the coaching staff for the quarterback, similar to what the Philadelphia Eagles did. The Philadelphia Eagles said, look, we're going to get a head coach who understands quarterbacks. We're going to get an offensive coordinator who understands quarterbacks. Bucs are doing the same thing. On defense, Todd Bowles reunited with Bruce Arians. Bowles has a long history of being a very good defensive coach. Look, he may not be head coaching material, but he's definitely defensive coordinator material, and I think he can elevate that Bucs defense that has a lot of talent. Gerald McCoy, Jason Pierre-Paul. Will they bring back Kawan Alexander? If they do, that's another beast on that defense. And don't forget about that secondary. Vernon Hargreaves, I know there were some issues with injuries and health this year, but if he comes back next year and he's ready to go, he's another guy who can have a big year under Todd Bowles. I think the Bucs are a prime candidate to make the postseason next year. I think them and the Packers, those two organizations with their new coaches, have the best chance to make the postseason along with the Browns. You know, looking at the situations in Denver and the Jets in New York and Cardinals, I don't know if those organizations are going to have as good of a chance to make the postseason. A lot depends on who their for the Broncos, who their quarterback is. For the Arizona Cardinals, the development of Josh Rosen and Cliff Kingsbury's ability to manage the NFL. You know, Brian Flores, that's a major rebuild down in Miami. And I'm looking at the Jets, and look, you play in the AFC. There's only so much better you can get in 1 year. But I do think for the Bucs, for the Browns, and for the Packers, I think those are three franchises that can definitely get back to the postseason next year with their new head coaches. Coming up next, my conversation with 97.3 ESPN.com Eagles beat writer Scott Grayson. He travels with the team each year. He was in the locker room after every game. We had him on the podcast last year to recap the Eagles season, and we bring him back again this year for insights into the Eagles locker room right here on the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Joining me on this episode of the Mutant Blitz Podcast, he joined us last year on the podcast after the Eagles won the Super Bowl run. Well, he was with the team all year again this year, traveling everywhere from New Orleans to London to Los Angeles. He is 97.3 ESPN.com Eagles beat writer, covers the team for us in a great way. Scott Grayson with his Grayson's Grades every week, and he had video and audio from the players' locker room after every game. Scott, I appreciate you taking the time tonight. How you doing?
I'm doing good, Josh. Thanks for having me.
So the first thing I wanted to start with was, what for you, covering this team, seeing this team every week, regular season and postseason, what for you, what was the biggest difference between last season and this season?
I think they really were two completely different seasons. I don't think anybody expected them to be that way. I think this team and all the fans certainly expected that they were going to pick up right where they left off, and that obviously was not the case. Everything from Nick Foles starting because Carson wasn't ready to then Wentz coming in week 3. And really the demeanor in the locker room was totally different. This team was really trying to find its identity. Injuries bit them early, and they continued to try to find their way through that. And they just seemed lost at times in the locker room when we were talking to them after they blew a 17-point fourth quarter lead to the Panthers, after they should have won in overtime against the Titans and didn't. Early in the season, they were dealing with those kinds of adversity. And I think the most impressive thing to me from seeing these guys along the way was when they finally turned the corner by winning that game in L.A., and really even before that, when they lost in New Orleans, how lost they seemed there, how much it seemed to them. The impression I got from body language was that these guys really started to see the season going bye-bye. And the fact that they fought through that and were able to get into playoffs, win a playoff game on the road, overall, while I think everybody thought they should have won the game in New Orleans, and maybe they should have, still a very productive season.
When you look at the team, it's not like there was a lot of differences in the personnel. Obviously, there were a few guys who were different. No Torrey Smith. We didn't see Mike Wallace all this year, but there were a lot of injuries. Was there a point in the season for you being in that locker room that it seemed like the injury issue is just taking a toll on them?
I think it was probably at the point where I would say that maybe they might have felt that way, even though they never pointed fingers. And to their credit, they did never turn on each other in the locker room in public. Maybe inside privately they might have at times, but I never got that impression. I think it was after they lost to New Orleans when they had their fifth, sixth string defensive backs in the game when they lost 48-7 in that November game. At that point, it felt like, okay, the injuries just became too much to overcome. But they were able to get enough guys healthy again after that to at least start getting that secondary back. And I think Malcolm Jenkins deserves a lot of credit, as does Jim Schwartz, in the sense that they talked about how we need to dumb down our defense a little bit because these guys are so young and inexperienced. We can't make it too complicated or they're spending too much time thinking and not reacting. And I think it's no coincidence that when they made that change, the secondary started performing a little bit better. The front four started also getting more pressure on the quarterback. That also helped, so they weren't covering for as long. So certainly injuries took their toll. These guys never use that as an excuse. They certainly didn't last year when they won the Super Bowl. And I think that's a big credit to the character of this locker room. But like every team's going to go through, they're going to have some turnover. And they're going to lose some guys who have been, at least I think they will, guys who have been staples in that locker room. And they're going to have to find new leadership along the way. And sometimes that's very difficult to do.
Scott, when you talk about leadership, I heard a lot in your interviews and post games with guys like Ertz, Jenkins, and even Jason Kelce. There were times this year it felt like those guys looked around at their own teammates and said, look, we get it that you guys feel like you accomplished something last year, but it's almost like they had to remind their own teammates that last year is in the past. They got to focus on the present. I remember Kelce talking about accountability. I remember Ertz talking about, we're a better offense than this. This is a team that scored 6 less points a game than last year. This is a team that Malcolm Jenkins mentioned the fact that, he felt that there were times that guys had lost focus. Where do you think along the way guys actually started understanding that last year was in the past?
Probably somewhere around mid-season. When they went to London, it seemed like they had really taken that trip on as a time to really show that they could turn a corner there. And I really sensed in the locker room that they felt they had. When they beat the Jaguars there, knowing that they had a bye week coming up, they were flying back across the Atlantic with a win. They would have been 3-5 if they lost. Instead, they were 4-4, and there's a big difference between those two records. And they acknowledged that to me after the game. I think at that point they started to realize that, last year was definitely in the past, that this team had to find its own way around that without that happening. And I think that, you talked about the veterans. I think those guys tried to get that message across early when, like Malcolm Jenkins said, he wanted the Super Bowl champions thing taken down in the locker room at the Link and over at their practice facility. He didn't want to see that. That was last year. When we're in the locker room, it's this year. We're focused on this year. I really think that was his message early on, trying to get that across to these younger players, that what we did last year doesn't matter. There's a whole new season, and if we're not ready to take it on, we're going to get burned by these people who want to take us down, because they did have a target on their backs, and I was curious how they'd play with that target. And certainly injuries took a toll, but I think that they had to learn how to play as a team that everybody wanted to take down, as opposed to a team that they could just sneak up on other opponents occasionally last year, and people weren't taking them seriously at times.
This was one of those seasons where, a lot of guys were either coming back from injuries. They got injured halfway through the season. Wentz coming off of his injury. Jeffrey coming off of surgery. Graham even coming off of stuff. Tim Jernigan coming off of his back surgery. And one of the things that Doug Peterson brought up at his end of the season press conference, Scott, was the fact that he felt that because Wentz didn't have a full off season to train and practice and we're getting integrated into the offense, that it's almost like Wentz was making up for lost time. And I'm kind of wondering, Scott, you look at Wentz, you look at Jernigan, you look at Jeffrey. Were there times that you saw this year that it looked like guys were almost making up for lost time? Like we always hear about Bill Belichick. He kind of treats September like the preseason. Was it almost like a lot of these guys who were coming off of injuries were getting their preseason reps as the season was progressing?
Yeah, I think it was no more evident than it was with Carson Wentz, partly because of the position he plays. And I was saying that pretty much all season, that here's a guy who didn't have those off-season reps. While everybody else was doing OTAs and getting spring workouts in, working out in between on their own and getting ready for the season and having training camp, Carson didn't. He was still going through rehab, and he was really pushing himself, as we saw. I don't doubt that he might have rushed himself back a little bit. And as a result, I had been talking about, too, throughout the season on 97.3. It looked to me like his mechanics were off a little bit, and I'm not surprised then if he was not stepping through his throws because he's still working on having mental, trust in that knee that was injured and surgically repaired. I'm not surprised he was putting a little bit of extra pressure on his back. Just the way that you're compensating without doing it consciously, it took its toll. And so I think a guy like Carson Wentz who gets a full, and I've been saying, to me, you got to respect what Nick Foles did with this team over the last 2 years. Absolutely. But the ceiling's higher with Carson Wentz. I think you saw that level of play that he has and will get back to, in my opinion, with a full offseason of work. He's talked about the offseason of work. And don't forget, too, one of the things that he did in that season before, in the spring, before he had that great year where everybody thought he was going to win MVP and then got hurt, he had guys come out to North Dakota with him, receivers. They worked on timing. They got their chemistry down. They even were hanging out off the field to build some of that bonding. You can't underestimate some of the importance of that stuff when they get in those crunch moments out in the game and you start believing and knowing what a guy's going to do. Carson had to rebuild some of that with these guys. And then Alshon, too, as you brought up, was also hurt, so that timing was off for a while as well. And I think that just is so valuable for these guys to have. And they will have a little bit of rest here. They will get their bodies right, and they're going to go back to work because the way this season ended, especially for Alshon Jeffrey, is not going to be something they're going to sit well with. They want to start working towards next year. And once Carson can, I think a full offseason of work is going to get him back to the kind of play where he had 2 years ago.
Scott, speaking of Jeffrey and the offense, I went ahead and ran the numbers when the season ended because once the season is done, you can kind of get a final picture of the season. And what I did was I ran the numbers, Foles versus Wentz, right? Wentz, he played 11 total games. Foles, regular season and postseason was 7 games. Well, guess what? With Wentz, they scored 22 points a game. With Foles, 22.14 points per game. The offense the entire season struggled. How much do you attribute that to the situation at quarterback? And how much do you attribute that to possibly the fact that there was no more Frank Reich and no more John DeFilippo in the room with Doug Peterson?
I initially credited that as a big reason why they were struggling. I thought that, look, the evidence is starting to show without Reich and DeFilippo, Peterson's opening script is not clear. It's not crisp. It's not good. They weren't scoring in the first quarter. How many times? We were talking about that forever. And then that went away. And we never mentioned it again after the New Orleans game, really. And so I think that you saw, Doug start figuring out how to call the game better. I think, honestly, he did understand how to call the game a little better with Nick Foles in the season. Now, I think when you give Doug a full offseason with Carson, again, and they're working through training camp, right? In training camp, you're finding the plays that work with the guys that are out there running the plays. Carson wasn't out there running the plays for Doug to see, he's doing this well, maybe not so well with that. And so he had to start calling and scripting, plays with very little reps to see how they would perform. And I think that took its toll as well. So initially I thought that the loss of Reich and DeFilippo really hurt the play calling. Ultimately, I think I got to the point where, it probably hurt a little bit not having them there, but ultimately I gained more confidence back in Doug again, the way that he started having some opening scripts with a guy who he knew and had a lot of work with throughout the season with reps. And I think when he gets back to that with Carson, we'll see a better performance at the opening of games next year as well.
Doug said that he thinks that there are things that Wentz has and can learn from watching Foles play this season and last season. But are there some things that maybe Doug can learn from what he did with Foles last year and this year that he can help Wentz with in 2019?
Yeah, I think they definitely can. And I think, look, part of it, too, I think, was this was not the same Carson Wentz as well. Look, last year when Carson would clear the pocket or break away, he looked to run and found a hole, and he would take advantage of some space. This year, I think they told him, and we pretty much had heard this, that they didn't want him running. They didn't want him taking unnecessary shots. And I think they kind of took that a little too far. The pendulum swung too far in one direction. I think that the right place is somewhere in the middle. Carson needs to pick his spots where he takes off, and he needs to find time where he can extend plays. And that's one area where I think he can do that better, and I think that's one thing he can work on. I think Doug can call better rollouts when needed to give Carson some extra time. I think Carson throws very well on the run. I think he's very comfortable doing it. And I think at times Doug needs to find a way to get that into the mix. I also think Carson's very smart. It didn't look to me like he had a lot of time to change plays at the line like he did the year before. That was one area that I thought it looked to me like he was very sharp at, was changing plays at the right time, getting the right plays. And when there was a bad play call, they would get out of it, and he did that. And this year I didn't think he had that freedom. I'm not sure why. Again, part of it might be because he didn't have the reps and the training camp behind him to do that. So I think there's a little bit, you're right, that Doug can learn with Carson and that Carson can learn with Doug. Those two definitely need to grow more. But again, the ceiling to me is very high for Carson, for Doug, and Carson together. And I think they have the potential, and potential is a dangerous word, but I think they have the potential to have a very long, successful career together if they can get that worked out right.
I know there's a lot of people out there who, they not maybe as much as they used to be, but there are a lot of people who looked at Foles and they almost worship the ground he walks upon. Look, the guy was a major part of helping this team get their first Super Bowl championship, and I think that they look at Wentz as a guy who can't stay healthy. And no matter how many examples of other quarterbacks who have injury histories, like Aaron Rodgers, Ben Roethlisberger, Andrew Luck, you bring up, I think some people still hold that injury issue against Wentz because he had it in college. He's had it a couple times down in the NFL. From your perspective, do you think Wentz is unlucky or do you think he is injury prone?
I think he took an unnecessary risk when he got hurt in L.A. I am not ready to label him injury prone. I think he rushed through his rehab. Ultimately, again, this is with the hindsight of 2020. I think he rushed through his rehab, and I would almost consider his injury this year and the way he played an extension of the injury he suffered last year, almost like it's one injury. And I'm not willing to label him injury prone. I think he can be smarter as a player. I think he can learn to avoid some of those shots. And look, other quarterbacks have had to learn this as well. Brett Favre, Aaron Rodgers, some of these guys took shots early in their careers, and they had to learn how to adapt. And I think Carson's in that position. I'm not ready to label him injury prone. But certainly, if he goes down and can't finish all 16 games next year, then you start wondering. And unfortunately, the Eagles have a big decision to make this year, and it's got to be this year that they got to make it, most likely. And I think they're making the right one and going with Wentz. But you can't underestimate what Foles accomplished here. In my opinion, Foles at some point should be, inducted into the Eagles Hall of Fame. He won a Super Bowl here. Nobody else has been able to do that. He does have a statue out front. And unfortunately, it's the business of the sport that's going to end up having to, rear its ugly head in this instance. But I'm not willing to label Wentz injury prone. I think that he is going to come back bigger, stronger, and healthier next year. And I think we're going to see a different Carson.
Scott Grayson joining me here on the Mutant Blitz Podcast. You can follow all of Scott's work at 97.3ESPN.com. He was with the team all season long. He traveled to London, New Orleans, Los Angeles, all across the country. Scott, one of the things you get the opportunity to have when you are covering the team and talking to players, that you get to see the ebb and flow, the emotional roller coaster of the season. And I think one of the people that we can describe that emotional roller coaster this season has been is for Jason Kelce. There were some reports that came out that he was considering retirement. John McMullen, our own from 97.3 ESPN.com, him and others have suggested that retirement talk has something to do with the fact that Kelce, he doesn't have guaranteed money on his contract moving forward. I know Jason Kelce at the end of the season wasn't 100% committal to playing. Being around Kelce for the last few years, what is your perspective on his short and long-term future with the Eagles?
Well, he's one of those guys that I mentioned earlier as being, a locker room presence, the guy who other players look up to. When you heard him talk, look, when I think about Jason Kelce, I will never forget standing there by him when he went and answered my question about after the Super Bowl win, where he went on that I wouldn't call it a rant, but he went on that honestly, he let his guard down and he talked about how he didn't have any Division I offers. He was a guy who had to work for everything he got. And you saw the passion for the game in him there and the sheer joy of winning that Super Bowl and what it meant to him. And then you come back this year, and it's a difficult year, and they've worked through some issues. He at times wasn't healthy. I think he is genuinely considering retirement, but I do also agree that without the guaranteed money there, and he's also not one of the highest paid centers in the league. He's not even in the top 5. I think he wants to see a little bit more respect thrown his way for what he's accomplished. And quite frankly, I think he deserves it. He's one of those rare centers who the Eagles, in my opinion, didn't run enough screens this year, but when they run them, Kelce's that guy out front who really paves the way and springs the back or the receiver for a big play. And I think he gets downfield. He can move. He's agile. As long as he's healthy, he is really the core of that line and doesn't get enough credit for it. All the attention goes to the tackles, Jason Peters, Lane Johnson. But I think Jason Kelce, I think part of this is a little bit of a ploy to try to see if he can get more money. And I think he's content at this point to say, if I don't get any more money, I'm also not willing to put my body through what I'm doing now. So I think he's really sitting on the fence, and he's kind of waiting for the Eagles to make a play.
I'm really glad you used that verbiage, put his body through, because I got to see him work out in Ocean City a couple of years ago with Vinny Curry. Him and Vinny Curry, they would come down to Ocean City to a local gym down there and work out. And I don't think people appreciate how hard some of these athletes work. And, as someone who hits the gym myself, you can tell after being in the gym a while who works hard and who really works hard. And Jason Kelce is one of those guys who he's always been an undersized guy. Sometimes we considered him almost a liability in 2015 and 2016 at times. And he's really turned himself into this elite high-level center where you can consider him one of the 5 best in the NFL. So I would have to think that with Roseman's history of taking care of players, that they're going to have to do something to make sure that he is genuinely taken care of this offseason. I think they know that, look, Sayamalo didn't play that well this year, Scott. And I think that they originally thought maybe Sayamalo would be the center of the future. Well, when Kelce missed time, it was Wisniewski going in there at center. It wasn't Sayamalo. I think it's a sign to me that they know that their future at center right now is has a bit of a void. And you know what? You mentioned Kelce's a leader in the locker room. He's a leader on the field. And I think that they got to take care of this guy because they don't really have a backup plan.
No, and it's a position that, look, center is the guy who starts the communication for the rest of the line as to who's picking up who. And I think it's to a regular fan, the position of center is probably overlooked. It's like, well, it's the guy who just snaps the ball. No, they do a lot more than that. And Jason Kelce's been very good at recognizing, where the guys should be blocking on the line. And the success of the line in general trickles down from what he calls. Now, all that being said, Kelce is one of the people that, look, you cannot let emotion get involved when you're trying to build a championship team. Loyalty can only go so far in the business world of the sport. And you're talking about guys who are older players that they need to think about whether or not they're keeping. Jason Peters, Darren Sproles, Jason Kelce you could throw into that. These are all guys who are you've got to figure out, and you don't have enough money to feed all of them. So you got to figure out how you're going to get creative with all that. If you want to keep all of them, do you keep all of them? And then on the defensive side of the ball, there's other guys too, like a Brandon Graham. Is he going to be back? So there's definitely some questions for some players who have become staples here, again, in the locker room as well as on the field and with their play, that the organization has some big questions to answer as to who they go after, who they want to keep. But you're right. I don't know that they have the guy that they thought they did to be able to take over for Kelce. That was Sayamalu. It was supposed to be Sayamalu. Whether they think he can do that or not, you're right. Wisniewski's the guy who came in when Kelce went down. So they've got some decision-making to do and figure out, and maybe they need to pay Kelce a little better to get a guy in here who they think could be the next guy to take over for Kelce if they don't believe it's Sayamalu. So if you get to that point, you obviously have to keep Kelce here in order to train the next guy. So there's some decision-making that needs to go on. There's going to be some posturing on both sides, I'm sure, between the Eagles and Kelce. And his route, it looks like he's going to take is, if I don't get what I'm looking for, I'm just going to retire. So we'll see.
Scott, I want to ask you a couple more specific players before I let you go. I appreciate your time here.
Sure.
One of the guys you got to talk to a lot each and every week was Zach Ertz. And Zach Ertz had a historic season. He didn't just break the Eagles record for receptions in a season. He broke the NFL record for tight end receptions in a season. This is a guy who, just a few years ago, people were wondering, is this guy ever going to live up to the expectations? This guy, people expected him to be XYZ. Well, he was the number one statistical tight end in the NFL. Pro Football Focus rated him number one. In fantasy football, people, they loved him because he was putting up these big numbers each and every week. Do you feel like in some ways that this season maybe overshadowed at the end the kind of job and the kind of production that Ertz put forward? And how much more do you think we can expect from him after a record-breaking season?
Well, that's a big question. Let me start with the beginning of what you asked. And it's funny because I kind of thought about this when he broke the record. I remember talking to Ertz, a few years ago when Selleck was still the guy here. And Ertz was trying to get his way in. And, of course, the big knock was he just couldn't block. He really took that to heart. He put a chip on his shoulder. It took a while, but he finally developed into a better blocker so that he could stay on the field more. Everybody knew when he was on the field, he's not there to block, he's there to catch, so they would line up, somebody to cover him. Now he's at the point where they're just not sure, and he's proven to be a big mismatch for whoever goes up against him. I think what we saw with his production was largely the fact that he was such a security blanket for Carson Wentz. He was the guy that Wentz really felt comfortable throwing to. You saw that. They have a great relationship on and off the field, and I think that led to, at times, when Wentz needed a play, that's who he went to. And Ertz produced. But with Foles, I felt like Ertz was not that kind of security blanket for a guy like Foles. I felt like Foles more looked at Alshon Jeffrey, and maybe that's where the chemistry was better with those two players. But I think in terms of what Ertz could be, at times I felt like they were feeding him too much. And the other thing is, one thing that happened this season, particularly late in the year, was the evolution of rookie Dallas Goedert at tight end. And we saw another tight end start establishing and emerging himself to be a guy who could be reliable. He had some catches down the stretch and in the playoffs as well. So now you've got potentially probably the best tight end combination in the league evolving here. And I think that's what Doug wants. Doug wants strength over the middle and a guy on the outside who has to at least be accounted for. And that's what they missed by not having Mike Wallace out there. They did have Alshon Jeffrey on the one side, but that wasn't enough. And so I think you get some more speed on the other side, and you've got the two tight ends over the middle. I think the Eagles' offense is very close. If you can just get it and stay healthy, perhaps get a good number one running back in there that they can trust to stay healthy as well, that this offense could really start humming. And Zach Ertz is going to be a big part of that production. I don't know that he'll do what he did again because he needs to get the opportunities, and you can only spread the ball around so many times. So I think we'll see as it goes, but he's a guy who gets mismatches, and I think Carson Wentz learned that my odds are in favor of us completing the pass and making the play if I give Zach a chance.
Another guy you spoke to a lot throughout the season was Malcolm Jenkins. He's already 31 years old. He's been in the league for a decade now. The guy's had a very productive, just a really great career. Sometimes it's been overshadowed because of the fact that he's not putting up crazy stats, but he's just been such a steady part of this defense, a guy that the defensive coordinator, Jim Schwartz, can rely on. His teammates follow him. How many more years do you think that we can see this high level of play from Jenkins? I'm not saying that I think his skills are diminishing, but Father Time catches up to everybody. And I feel like for a guy like him, he started as a cornerback. He moved to safety. He's basically extended his career because of his flexibility and his ability and has such a knack for being in the right place at the right time sometimes. What kind of long-term future do you think he has in the NFL?
Well, he's really like a player coach out on the field. He's that smart. He's got that much experience, and I think he's a guy that Schwartz learned he can really lean on the field and listen to for input. And I think that's why when Malcolm said to him, we need to dumb down the defense a little bit because of all the inexperience in the secondary, that Jim Schwartz listened to him and went along with that, and they found a way to progress that made it easier on everybody to go out there and just play ball. I think a large amount of credit goes to Malcolm Jenkins for that. As far as Father Time catching up to him, I start feeling like he's still got gas in the tank, but I feel like the window is getting closer to closing for him. Not saying that he's there yet, but you look at his versatility, and it's underrated and underappreciated, I think, by a lot of the regular fans out there. Here's a guy who you mentioned he played corner, played safety. He is a safety now, but he plays at times like a linebacker. And there's many games where he ends up leading the team in tackles. And that's because he can come up to the line. He can play up there. Then he gives Jim Schwartz so much opportunity to disguise coverages. Now you see Malcolm Jenkins up on the line. If you're the other quarterback and you're thinking, is he blitzing? Is he going to drop back in coverage? Because he's done all that. Who's he going to pick up? Is he getting a running back coming across the field? Because he can hang with them. And so I think that, his value is, I don't think, appreciated enough by the regular fan. And I think he's, like I said, he's still got some gas in the tank. I think he's a very, you talk about guys who are rocks in the locker room. He is one of them. And I'll tell you what, I saw him many times in the middle and earlier part of the season when Rasul Douglas was not really getting on the field. I thought Rasul did pretty well in the playoffs last year, and then he really didn't see the field for the first half of the year here until injuries started happening again, and then he came back out on the field. He was constantly in the locker room after games approaching Malcolm Jenkins, and the two of them were spending a few minutes talking about some things. And I really saw Jenkins taking Douglas under his wing, and I don't doubt that that's part of the reason why Douglas ended up having what I thought was did a good job of filling in on the injury front and playing a good cornerback position. In fact, I think they really missed him in New Orleans when he got hurt in this playoff game. And I think Douglas and Jenkins were establishing a really good relationship that I'm curious to see if it continues through the offseason and perhaps in the next season as well. Jenkins has a lot to offer. Both, like I said, I think the best way to describe him is like a player coach because he is like a coach on the field. He takes those guys, he takes responsibility for helping to make some calls, and I think he really plays with a lot of passion. He's the kind of guy I think Eagle fans are easily able to appreciate.
Scott, one more before I let you go. You do your Grayson's grades throughout the season. You have a specific eye for the quality of play for different positions, different players each week. So heading into this offseason, what are your priorities if Howie Roseman came to you and asked you, what does this team need to prioritize? Because I think everyone's got an opinion and a perspective, but I want to get your perspective because you're around the players, you're grading these guys each and every week, so you have a different perspective than maybe the regular fan does about what this team is really lacking in, what their strengths are.
Well, I'll give you one on each side of the ball. In my opinion, they need to commit themselves to a solid number one running back. Whoever they want to decide that is, they've got to have a guy that needs to be held accountable or accounted for by the defense on the other side of the ball. And I just don't know that they had that, especially once Jay Ajayi went down. I mean, as long as he was in there, I think he could have been that guy. I think he was at times for them. But they weren't blocking as well on the offensive line either at that point. I think the line improved and got a lot stronger as the season went on, and at that point, Jay Ajayi was no longer in there. I don't think they know what they want to do at running back right now. So my thing to Howie would be figure out who your primary running back is and who your number two running back is. You got to have two good ones, but you need to have, I think, a 1A and then a 1 and a 2, rather than a 1A and 1B. And I think lately they've been hesitant to spend money at that position. I understand the injury factors that take place and the wear and tear that a running back suffers throughout the time during a season. But I think you got to find that guy to be a real true threat to aid Carson Wentz. I mean, look what Ezekiel Elliott does for Dak Prescott. Look what Saquon Barkley did for Eli Manning. I think you get a guy like that, and imagine how much better Carson could be. On the other side of the ball, I think they need to get a little younger at defensive line. I love Brandon Graham. I love Chris Long. I love Michael Bennett. I thought he played huge this year, but if they want to keep him, they're going to have to give him a little bit more money. Derek Barnett, I'm excited to see him come back healthy. And Fletcher Cox, of course, you got to keep him. But what do you do on that defensive line? They've got some good draft picks, good spots in the draft to be able to address that position, I believe, and I think they definitely need to. And then they need to figure out which of those guys they decide to try to keep around. Again, great locker room guys. So you've got to be careful of changing the chemistry of the locker room too much, but at the same time making sure that you are able to get younger at the positions you need to. So I would say get a good running back to really help make Carson Wentz better and get younger on that defensive line.
Scott Grayson covers the Eagles for 97.3 ESPN.com. You can follow him on Twitter at SGraysonNews. 973. He traveled with the Eagles all year long. He was in the locker room after each and every game. Scott, I appreciate you for the second straight year coming on the podcast and just giving a little bit more of an insight into this Eagles season. Final topic on this episode of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. The official first trailer for Spider-Man Far From Home came out on the internet this week, and I think it's fair to say that when you look at what Marvel and Sony have done with the Spider-Man character, it's just such a unique perspective on one of the most beloved characters in all of Marvel Comics. You know, people forget that Spider-Man was one of the original characters in all of Marvel Comics, and you're talking about a character now that you're bringing into the Marvel Cinematic Universe in a way that, let's be realistic, we have not seen a lot of this style of portrayal of a character, because most of the characters in the MCU, they're older, they're adults, and Spider-Man is truly just a kid. He's just a teenager in high school who has superpowers, and he's having to balance his life between being a kid and being a superhero. And it's an interesting contrast. A couple of things are pretty obvious from this film. One is that this is the next stage of Marvel after Avengers Endgame comes out. You know, you have 3 Marvel movies specifically coming out this year that are setting the future of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You have Captain Marvel that comes out. Then you have Avengers Endgame, which is basically Avengers Infinity War Part 2, followed by Spider-Man Far From Home. And after Endgame, Marvel's going to really need to lay a groundwork for what life is going to be like in this next stage. Remember, they've had basically over a decade of the same characters and type of storytelling. Now you're going to have this incredibly powerful and really impressive character on the big screen in Captain Marvel, Carol Danvers. You have this new Spider-Man in your universe. You have Black Panther. You have Doctor Strange. You're going to be going into a world where Tony Stark is not involved anymore, and there is no Captain America intricately involved. We don't know what the future holds for the Hulk. If you think about it, the Marvel Cinematic Universe moving forward, they are going to be using these 3 movies to catapult us into this next age. And you're seeing already in the trailer who is the man dealing with Spider-Man. It's no longer Tony Stark. It is the one and only Nick Fury. Nick Fury is going to be basically handling his role with Spider-Man very similar to the modern comic book era, which is in the Ultimate Comics with Spider-Man, with the modern age of Spider-Man. S.H.I.E.L.D. and Nick Fury have a extensive relationship in working with Spider-Man. And you see in the trailer that he goes to Europe with his friends thinking, I'm going to take a couple weeks off from being Spider-Man, and now all of a sudden he's pulled back in because he's dealing with these phenomenons, these creatures that are basically element-based. One is water, a water beast, another one is a sand beast, popping up around the world. And Nick Fury brings Spider-Man in to help them deal with it. And the villain in the movie is Mysterio. And Mysterio, a character named Quentin Black, is being played by Jake Gyllenhaal. He's going to come off as looking like a hero, and that's kind of what he does in the trailer. It looks like he is going to be the guy to save everybody from these elemental creatures. The history behind Mysterio is that he is a guy who creates illusions. In the comics originally, Mysterio was a guy who set up special effects and illusions for movies, and he wanted to take his abilities at doing that and become a supervillain. And he has certain levels of success because a lot of his ability to manipulate people and be an illusionist is based on the fact of, do you know you're looking at an illusion? Can you see through his illusion? Are you have strong enough mind and senses to be able to work through whatever illusion or whammy he's been put on you? And you see in the trailer, he looks like he's trying to present himself as a hero. Maybe he's using this persona of himself as a hero as a disguise for what he's really trying to do with other nefarious elements that he is involved in. And Nick Fury brings in Spider-Man, and you get to see Spider-Man in 3 different suits in the trailer. You get to see him in a stealth suit, you get to see him in a black and red Spider-Man suit, and then his traditional blue and red. So it looks like Spider-Man is going to be adding to his wardrobe of spider suits, and they're kind of giving Spider-Man the similar treatment what they gave Iron Man, which is in every movie you get to see a new suit or two. I'm going to make the assumption, even though there's a lot of people online who don't want to make this assumption, but I'm willing to make this assumption. I believe this movie is going to be chronologically after Avengers Endgame. Because remember, at the end of Avengers Infinity War, Spider-Man tells Tony Stark, I don't want to go. He doesn't say he doesn't want to die, which is why a lot of people believe that the characters that you saw evaporate in Avengers Infinity War make a comeback in Avengers Endgame, whether that's through time travel, whether that's these people being brought back from Soul World, which is the dimension that exists inside the Soul Stone itself, which Thanos has his hands on. Whatever the way they bring these characters back, they do. And I think that there are going to be either Tony Stark and or Steve Rogers die in Endgame. And as a result, Spider-Man may be part of the reason why he just wants to go to Europe and hang out with his friends, because he's had a rough year. Maybe he doesn't want to deal with what just happened with him and his friends in Europe. Now, I'm not going to deny there's a possibility that Far From Home happens before Avengers Endgame, okay? I'm not going to totally discount that possibility. I think it would be a little bit goofy if they did have the events of Far From Home happen before Infinity War happened. That would be a little goofy, but there may be some reasons for that. We know that Nick Fury and Maria Hill are working together. At the end of Infinity War, they're seen together getting out of the van before they both evaporate thanks to Thanos' finger snap. We know that Nick Fury has an integral role in the Captain Marvel movie that's coming out this year. So we know Fury's going to be making appearances in other Marvel movies. Maybe there's a lot that Nick Fury is kind of like the connection between all these different movies and moving the Marvel Cinematic Universe forward. But either way, the introduction of a classic Spider-Man villain, Mysterio, opens up the door for eventually Marvel to bring in a third Spider-Man movie and have the Sinister Six. They're already starting to build that crew in prison. We saw at the end of the first Spider-Man Tom Holland movie, Vulture was trying to start recruiting people to work with him. I think we're eventually going to see Shocker. We know that Mysterio has historically been a part of the Sinister Six at times in different points. We know we saw Oscorp in the trailer, so we know that Osborn is in this universe. He does exist. We don't know what his role is in this universe yet, but I know we're going to find out eventually. You don't show those little Easter eggs just for nothing. Marvel has a big plan for Tom Holland moving forward, and I think we're building toward a third Spider-Man movie and Spider-Man's inclusion into a new Avengers team. But a lot of that is going to be predicated on what happens in this Far From Home movie, because we saw a couple of reveals at the end of the first Spider-Man movie, and a interesting tidbit in Infinity War. Let's recap them. 1, at the end of Homecoming, Aunt May finds out that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Number 2, we know that there is already a developing relationship between Spider-Man and other superheroes. You know, Nick Fury knows who he is. He knows who Nick Fury is. He is known Tony Stark. Tony Stark, he goes with him to fight Thanos. He gets the Iron Spider armor for his new Iron Man suit. We know that Maria Hill is going to be in this movie. Well, why? What is the importance of having Maria Hill in this movie unless she is going to have a further role in the MCU going forward as well? We know that in Age of Ultron, she was basically a liaison between the Avengers and S.H.I.E.L.D. elements and the government. We know that Nick Fury is no longer director of S.H.I.E.L.D., but he is still very involved in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We also know that Marvel is trying to portray Spider-Man very differently than they saw Sony doing previously. You know, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man were very specific character types. Leaving high school, going to college, growing up. Well, Tom Holland is portrayed much younger than Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield's characters were in their chronologies. While Maguire and Garfield were graduating high school, Parker in this movie with Tom Holland, this Peter Parker, is basically a sophomore going into his junior year of high school. So you're a little bit different point in the development and the aging of the character. So you have a little bit more flexibility in what direction you want to take him big picture. I do think Marvel and Sony are setting a groundwork for a Spider-Man versus all of his biggest villains kind of showdown. I think that introducing Mysterio also allows Marvel to tell a different story than all the other movies have told. The original Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire, you saw the Green Goblin, you saw Sandman, you saw Dr. Octavius, Doc Ock, you saw Venom, which was a horrible Venom. The third Spider-Man movie was an abomination. And then you saw Andrew Garfield. You saw the villains he had to deal with. You saw that they really dug a little deeper into making it a little bit more darker, being willing to embrace the 1970s comics of Spider-Man, where Spider-Man does get a little bit dark in the 70s and 80s. And with Andrew Garfield, they were a little bit more flexible in dealing with the Lizard, in dealing with Electro, in dealing with these different Spider-Man characters. And I think Marvel has said, look, we don't want to just repeat what you saw previously. We don't want to do the same thing again and again. We want to do something totally different with Spider-Man, and by introducing very classic Spider-Man villains like the Vulture and like Mysterio with major actors. I mean, these are actors who, let's be realistic, for all intents and purposes, this is a big deal the way they went about portraying these villains. And I think that Marvel is definitely building towards something with Spider-Man's role in the universe, with Spider-Man overall. And I think that the end game at the end of Avengers and whatever the groundwork is being set by Far From Home is going to be what Marvel builds around long term in the future, with not just Spider-Man, not just Avengers, but also with what Marvel wants to do when they introduce the X-Men and when they introduce the Fantastic Four. The other Easter egg we saw in the trailer was the Baxter Building. The Baxter Building in New York is the base of operations for the Fantastic Four. So they're already setting the groundwork for the Fantastic Four, for Oscorp's involvement. I think all of those things may have a role in the future of not just Spider-Man, but also the Avengers in a world after you may not have Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr. in the Marvel Cinematic Universe anymore. So you're setting the groundwork already for what the future holds beyond 2019. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. If you like the content we bring you, hit that subscribe button, hit the like button down below so you catch each episode as we come out. Also, if you have any thoughts on the topics from today's show, drop in the comments section below. Here on the Mutant Blitz Podcast, Josh Hennig here. I bring you my perspective on my two favorite topics in the world, sports and the comic book, movies, and television shows that are out there. And I'll catch you on the next episode of the Mutant Blitz Podcast.